Mona thought she could handle it. The whispers, the stares, the cruelty. But today, something changed. Something no one expected. Stay until the end to witness the moment that changed everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Mona walked through the narrow streets of the small British village, her school bag clutched tightly in her hands. The air was crisp, and the trees barely rustled as a soft breeze passed through. To an outsider, the village would seem peaceful, idyllic even, but to Mona, it was nothing more than a cage. A place where she was constantly reminded that she was different. A place where she did not belong. She'd always been the only black girl in her school, the only one who stood out among the sea of pale faces. At first, she had thought she could ignore it, that if she simply smiled and tried to be kind, the others would accept her. But the whispers had started early, the cruel glances, the hushed giggles whenever she walked past. Then, as the years passed, the bullying became more open. She could still hear their laughter echoing in her ears from earlier that day, the way they had surrounded her in the hallway, sneering as they yanked her school bag from her hands and spilled its contents across the floor. She had scrambled to pick up her books, but one of the boys had kicked them down the hall, laughing as she scurried after them. "Why are you even here?" one of the girls had said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You'll never fit in." Mona had said nothing. She never did. Words wouldn't change anything. They wouldn't stop the cruelty or the exclusion. They wouldn't make her feel any less alone. Her hands tightened around the strap of her bag as she neared home. Her house wasn't far from school, just a few streets down past the village square. It was a modest home, small but warm, with ivy creeping up the walls and a garden her mother tended to with careful hands. Inside, the smell of baked bread often filled the air, and the walls were lined with books, a quiet refuge from the world outside. She hesitated at the door before stepping inside. Her mother stood at the kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough. She looked up and smiled, but the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. "You're home late," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Everything okay?" Mona forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, just had to stay behind to finish some work." It wasn't a complete lie. She had stayed behind, but only because she had spent 10 minutes in the bathroom trying to stop herself from crying after the incident in the hallway. Her mother didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. "Your father's coming home tonight," she said, changing the subject. "He sent a letter last week. His ship docked this morning." Mona's heart lifted slightly. Her father was a sailor, spending months at sea before returning home for brief visits. She missed him terribly when he was gone. When he was home, he would tell her stories about the places he had seen, bring her gifts from faraway lands, and fill the house with laughter. "Really?" she asked, her voice brightening for the first time that day. Her mother nodded. "He should be here soon. Why don't you go wash up before dinner?" Mona nodded, slipping off her shoes before making her way to her room. The small space was her sanctuary, her escape. She collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. Her chest still ached from the weight of the day, but at least she had something to look forward to now. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Her mother peeked in. "He's here." Mona bolted upright and rushed down the stairs. The moment she saw her father standing in the doorway, she ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. He laughed, lifting her off the ground in a tight embrace. "I missed you, little one," he said, ruffling her hair as he set her down. "I missed you too," she said, her voice muffled against his jacket. He pulled back and grinned. "I brought you something." Mona's eyes lit up. He always brought her something, a trinket, a book, something from a distant land she had never seen. But this time he wasn't carrying anything. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "What is it?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "This," he said, kneeling down in front of her, "is very special." Carefully, he unwrapped the cloth, revealing a tiny snake curled in his hands. Its scales were sleek and dark, a deep, glossy black with a faint shimmer in the light. Mona's breath caught. "A snake?" Her father nodded. "She's a cobra, but don't worry, she was born without fangs. She's not venomous, completely harmless." Mona hesitated, staring at the small creature. She had never taken care of a pet before, let alone a snake, a living creature. It was a responsibility, something that required care and attention. The snake uncoiled slightly, lifting its head, its golden eyes blinking up at her. Something inside her softened. She reached out tentatively, and the cobra flicked its tongue, tasting the air before slithering gently into her hands. Its body was warm, surprisingly soft, the way it moved graceful and fluid. A slow smile broke across her face. "I'll take care of her," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." Her father grinned. "Then she's yours." Mona held the tiny snake close, feeling its warmth against her palms. For the first time in a long time, something inside her didn't feel so heavy. She looked up at her father. "I'll call her Onyx." Her father chuckled. "A strong name. I like it." That night, Mona sat by her window, Onyx curled around her wrist, the stars twinkling above, distant and untouchable. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel completely alone. She whispered into the night to no one in particular. "Maybe things will get better." Onyx flicked her tongue, letting out a soft hiss as if she understood. Mona could only hope she was right. Mona woke up to the soft, almost rhythmic sensation of movement against her wrist. Blinking in the dim morning light, she turned her head and saw Onyx curled up, her sleek black body shifting slightly as she adjusted her position. The cobra lifted her head, flicking her tongue as if sensing Mona's awakening. For a brief moment, Mona let herself enjoy the comfort of having someone, or something, by her side. But that moment was fleeting. As soon as she glanced at the clock, reality settled in. Another day at school, another day of whispers, taunts, and humiliation. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to sit up. She dressed in silence, her movements slow and mechanical, the weight of the day already pressing down on her. As she buttoned her school blouse, Onyx slithered up her arm, resting lightly around her neck like a living piece of jewelry. Mona hesitated for a moment, tempted to take her to school, to keep her close where she could feel safe, but she knew it wasn't possible. Instead, she gently uncoiled Onyx and set her down in the small enclosure she had prepared beside her bed. The snake flicked her tongue, watching as Mona grabbed her bag and forced herself toward the door. Downstairs, her mother was preparing breakfast, the familiar smell of toast and eggs filling the kitchen. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, glancing over her shoulder, but the concern was still in her eyes, hidden beneath her warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" Mona nodded, though the answer was no. "Yeah," she lied, sliding into her seat at the table. Her father was reading the newspaper, sipping coffee, but he looked up as she sat down. "How's your new friend?" he asked with a grin. Mona managed a small smile. "She's fine." Her mother shot her husband a disapproving look. "I still don't know if bringing a snake into the house was the best idea," she muttered, shaking her head as she placed a plate in front of Mona. Mona didn't argue. She simply picked at her food, barely eating. She knew her parents meant well, but they wouldn't understand. They thought they could protect her, that this house was enough to shield her from the world outside, but they were wrong. She left the house without another word, her heart growing heavier with every step toward school. The air outside was cold, the sky overcast, a dull gray stretching endlessly above the village rooftops. She walked with her head down, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly her fingers ached. Maybe today would be different. Maybe they would leave her alone. They didn't. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it. The way the hallway grew just a little quieter, the way eyes shifted toward her, some filled with curiosity, others with amusement. She kept walking, pretending not to notice, but she knew what was coming. "Hey, freak!" She tensed but didn't stop. A group of girls stood near the lockers, watching her with smirks on their faces. One of them, Sarah, stepped forward, deliberately bumping into her shoulder. "Still not talking, huh?" she sneered. "You're so weird." Mona clenched her teeth, ignoring her, trying to move past, but another voice cut in. "Maybe she thinks she's better than us," Liam, one of the older boys, said from nearby, leaning against the lockers with a lazy grin. "Too good to even say hello." She didn't take the bait. She just needed to get to class, to disappear into her seat before things escalated. But before she could move, Sarah's hand shot out, yanking at the strap of her backpack. Mona stumbled backward as the bag was ripped from her shoulders, falling open, spilling her books across the floor. A laugh rippled through the group. "Oops," Sarah said mockingly, looking down at the mess. "You should really be more careful." Mona's hands curled into fists at her sides. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to fight back, to snatch her bag and push past them, but she knew better. She had learned long ago that standing up for herself only made things worse. So she swallowed the anger, knelt down, and started gathering her things as laughter echoed around her. One of the boys nudged a book with his foot, sending it sliding across the hallway. "Go get it," Liam taunted. Mona kept her head down, gripping the book in her shaking hands. Just breathe. Just survive. The bell rang, breaking the moment. The group lost interest, moving away, their laughter lingering in the air. Mona took a slow breath before rising to her feet, clutching her backpack tightly. No one helped her. No one ever did. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. She sat through her lessons in silence, staring blankly at the pages of her notebooks, her mind elsewhere. The teachers barely noticed her, just another quiet student blending into the background. That was how she survived. Lunchtime was the worst part of the day. She sat alone, as always, at the farthest table in the cafeteria. Her food was untouched. She had lost her appetite weeks ago. Around her, conversations buzzed, students laughing, talking, enjoying themselves, but she was invisible. Until she wasn't. A tray clattered onto the table in front of her. She flinched as she looked up and saw Liam standing over her, smirking. "You don't mind if I take this, do you?" he asked, already reaching for her sandwich. Mona said nothing. She just watched as he grabbed it, unwrapping it carelessly before taking a bite. The others at his table laughed, watching the show unfold. "You weren't gonna eat it anyway," he added, his voice dripping with amusement. Her hands trembled under the table. He leaned closer. "Why don't you ever talk, huh? Too scared?" More laughter. More voices. She didn't answer. She never did. That evening, when she finally made it home, she didn't go downstairs for dinner. She went straight to her room, locking the door behind her. Her breathing was uneven, her body still tense from the day's events. She sat on the bed, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the floor. Then she felt the familiar weight of onyx slithering up her arm. The snake coiled gently around her wrist, her head tilting, tongue flicking as if sensing Mona's distress. Mona swallowed the lump in her throat, stroking Onyx's sleek scales with shaky fingers. "At least I have you," she whispered. The cobra let out a soft, low hiss, pressing against her hand. Mona exhaled slowly, leaning back against the headboard. The pain didn't go away, but for a moment, just a moment, it was bearable. But deep down, she knew. Tomorrow would be worse. Mona woke up with the same heavy feeling in her chest that had been there for months. She stared at the ceiling for a long time before finally forcing herself to move. Her body ached, not from any physical injury, but from exhaustion. Every morning felt harder than the last. Every step towards school felt like walking into a battlefield with no armor. She moved slowly, her hands shaking as she pulled on her school uniform. Onyx was curled on the windowsill, her dark scales gleaming under the weak morning light. The cobra flicked her tongue, watching Mona with unblinking golden eyes. Mona reached out, letting her fingers trace over Onyx's smooth skin. "I don't want to go," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The snake coiled slightly but remained silent, as if she understood but had no words to offer in return. Downstairs, her mother was already bustling around the kitchen, her father sitting at the table with a newspaper in hand. The same routine, the same forced small talk. "Morning, sweetheart," her mother said as Mona sat down, but her voice held the same concern it always did. Mona barely touched her breakfast, pushing the food around her plate. She could feel their eyes on her, but no one said anything. She left without a word, stepping into the cold morning air. The walk to school felt like dragging herself through a quicksand, every step heavier than the last. She told herself, just get through the day, just make it to the end. But deep down, she knew. Something was different about today. The moment she stepped into the school hallway, she felt the shift. The air felt charged, expectant. It started with whispers, the way students turned their heads to look at her, some smirking, some laughing under their breath. Mona kept her head down, walking faster, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. She reached her locker and froze. The word was scrawled across the metal in thick black marker, bold and unmistakable. Freak. Her throat tightened. The world blurred for a moment. Laughter echoed behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. "Looks like someone left you a little message," Sarah's voice sang from behind her, filled with cruel amusement. Mona swallowed hard. She forced herself to move, yanking her locker open and shoving her books inside as if she could erase the word just by ignoring it. But she couldn't erase the feeling sinking into her bones. "Not gonna cry?" Liam's voice now, smooth and mocking. "You're tougher than I thought." She slammed the locker shut and walked away. The laughter followed her. The day dragged on, each class a blur, each moment heavier than the last. She didn't remember what the teacher said. She didn't care. The whispers, the stares, the quiet giggles whenever she walked by, it all pressed down on her, suffocating. Lunchtime came, and she hesitated in the hallway, her stomach twisting. She didn't want to go to the cafeteria, didn't want to sit alone and pretend not to hear them whisper about her, but where else could she go? Taking a deep breath, she forced herself inside. She moved to her usual spot in the corner, her tray untouched in front of her. She stared down at her food, willing herself to disappear. Then the tray was knocked from the table. The loud clatter echoed through the cafeteria. Food spilled across the floor. Gasps and laughter filled the air. Mona's body went rigid. She didn't move. "Oops," Sarah said, smirking down at her. "Didn't see you there." Mona's fingers curled into fists under the table. She felt it rising inside her. Something sharp, something burning. Liam leaned over her, his grin widening. "What's wrong? You look upset." She didn't speak. She just got up, stepping over the mess, and walked out. She could still hear them laughing as she left. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The whispers grew louder, the taunts sharper. She felt like she was suffocating, trapped inside her own body. The final bell rang, and she forced herself through the crowded hallways, desperate to get home, desperate to escape. She turned the corner toward her locker and stopped. Sarah stood there, holding something in her hands. Mona's sketchbook. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Sarah smirked as she flipped through the pages. "Wow," she said, holding up a drawing of Onyx. "You're obsessed with this stupid snake." Mona's breath caught in her throat. Another girl snatched the book, ripping out a page. "Oops," she said mockingly, crumpling it and tossing it to the ground. Mona's vision blurred. They were laughing, tearing out more pages, letting them fall like dead leaves at her feet. Her sketches, her escape, the only thing that was hers, were being destroyed right in front of her. She moved without thinking. Her hands shoved Sarah back, the force of it surprising even herself. The laughter died instantly. Sarah stumbled, eyes wide before her expression twisted in fury. "Did you just—" Liam didn't wait. He shoved Mona hard, sending her sprawling onto the ground. Pain shot up her palms as they scraped against the floor. She barely had time to recover before Sarah grabbed her by the collar of her shirt, yanking her up, her face inches from Mona's. "You're going to regret that," she hissed. The slap came fast and sharp. Mona barely registered the pain. The world tilted, the sound of laughter ringing in her ears like a cruel melody. Then a teacher appeared. Too late, as always. "What's going on here?" The group stepped back, their faces suddenly blank, innocent. "She started it," Liam said smoothly. Sarah crossed her arms, her lip curling in feigned hurt. "Yeah, she shoved me for no reason." The teacher's eyes landed on Mona, who was still on the ground, her cheek burning. She saw it in his expression. He wasn't going to do anything. He never did. "Both of you," the teacher sighed. "Detention after school." Mona didn't argue. She just picked up the torn remains of her sketchbook, her head low, and walked away. That evening, she didn't eat dinner. She sat in her room, Onyx coiled beside her, the snake pressed against her arm, warm and steady, but Mona barely felt it. She was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of trying. Tired of existing. She had thought she could endure it, that things would get better if she just kept going. But today had proved otherwise. Nothing was going to change. She reached for Onyx, pulling her close. The cobra let out a soft, quiet hiss, curling tighter around her wrist. "I don't want to do this anymore," she whispered. Onyx flicked her tongue, pressing against her hand. Mona closed her eyes. The weight was too much. Mona's body felt heavy as she woke up, though she wasn't sure what had pulled her from sleep. The room was silent, dimly lit by the street lamp outside her window. Onyx was curled beside her pillow, her dark scales gleaming faintly in the weak light. The snake lifted her head slightly, flicking her tongue as if sensing something was wrong. Mona stared at the ceiling, unmoving. Her limbs felt weighted, her chest hollow. She had spent the night trapped in her thoughts, the echoes of the day's events replaying over and over. The slap, the laughter, the torn pages of her sketchbook littering the hallway floor. She had thought she could handle it. She had thought if she just kept her head down, if she just endured, things would get better. But they never did. They never would. Downstairs, the faint murmur of voices drifted through the walls. Her parents were awake, speaking in hushed tones. She had heard them last night, too, their words thick with worry, their voices low but urgent. She had known for a while that her mother was growing more concerned, had noticed the way she watched her at dinner, the way she hesitated before asking how school was, the way her father's usual easy confidence had begun to crack around the edges. But they didn't know. Not really. They saw the quiet, the exhaustion, but they didn't see how deep it went. They didn't see how much of her had already disappeared. She sat up slowly, her movements sluggish. Onyx shifted, coiling slightly as Mona ran a hand over her smooth scales. The cobra didn't move away, just watched her with those unblinking golden eyes. Mona exhaled, her breath shaking. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. Onyx flicked her tongue in response, pressing against her fingers. She forced herself to get up. Her body protested every movement, her muscles aching with the weight of exhaustion. She changed into her school uniform without thinking, her hands moving as if disconnected from the rest of her. By the time she made it downstairs, her mother was waiting at the table, a plate of food in front of her. "Morning," she said softly. Her father glanced up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. Mona sat down, but she didn't eat. Her fingers traced patterns on the wooden surface of the table. Her mother cleared her throat. "Are you okay?" The words settled between them, heavy and thick. Mona nodded. "Yeah." Her mother didn't believe her. She could see it in her eyes, but she didn't push. Instead, she reached across the table, placing a gentle hand over Mona's. "We're here, you know," she said softly. "If something's wrong." Mona swallowed. "I know." Her father exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Maybe we should—" "I have to go," Mona interrupted, standing quickly. She grabbed her bag before either of them could say anything else. She could feel their eyes on her as she left, but she didn't look back. The walk to school felt longer than usual. The streets were quiet, the sky overcast, the air cold against her skin. Every step felt heavier than the last. She didn't want to go. She couldn't. But she had no choice. She stepped inside the building, keeping her head down, moving quickly through the hallways. But it didn't matter. She could feel them watching. The whispers started almost immediately, the quiet giggles, the knowing glances. She reached her locker and hesitated. The word was still there, bold and dark against the metal. "Freak." Her hands clenched into fists. She ignored it. She had to. Classes blurred together. The teachers spoke, but she didn't hear them. She took notes mechanically, her pen moving across the paper without thought. Every now and then, she caught glimpses of them, Sarah, Liam, the others, watching her, smirking, waiting. Lunchtime came and she didn't go to the cafeteria. She couldn't. Instead, she slipped outside, moving toward the far edge of the school grounds where no one would look for her. She sat on the cold bench, her arms wrapped around herself. She wished she had brought Onyx. She wished she had something, anything, to hold on to. The sky was dull and gray. The wind picked up, rustling the bare branches of the trees. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Maybe, if she stayed out here long enough, they would forget about her. Maybe, if she was quiet enough, small enough, she could just disappear. But they always found her, She heard them before she saw them, the laughter, the voices. She didn't move. "Mona." Sarah's voice was sickly sweet. She opened her eyes slowly. Sarah, Liam, and a few others stood in front of her. They weren't smiling. "Not going to say anything?" Liam taunted, tilting his head. Mona said nothing. Sarah sighed dramatically. "You really should be grateful we even bother with you at all. Otherwise, you'd just be invisible." Mona's hands clenched. She looked down at her lap, her breathing shallow. Liam chuckled. Maybe she finally learned her place. Something snapped. She moved without thinking. Before she could stop herself, she shoved Sarah backward, her hands shaking. The laughter died. Sarah stumbled, her eyes wide in shock before they narrowed in fury. "Did you just—" Liam grabbed Mona by the arm, yanking her back. His grip was tight, unforgiving. "Big mistake," he hissed. Then he shoved her. She hit the ground hard, pain jolting up her side. Someone gasped, but no one stepped in. No one ever did. Sarah loomed over her, her face twisted with anger. "You don't get to fight back, freak," she spat. The slap came fast. Mona barely registered it. The world tilted, the sounds around her distant and blurred. A teacher appeared. Too late, as always. "What's going on here?" The group stepped back, their faces shifting into innocent masks. "She started it," Liam said smoothly. Sarah crossed her arms. "Yeah, she shoved me out of nowhere." The teacher barely glanced at Mona, who was still on the ground, her cheek burning. "Detention," he sighed, "both of you." Mona didn't argue. She didn't say anything at all. She just stood up, grabbing her bag, her head low. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Detention was nothing new. Another empty room, another punishment for something that wasn't her fault. She sat in silence, staring at the clock, counting down the minutes until she could go home. By the time it was over, the sky had darkened. Rain had started to fall. She didn't go straight home. She couldn't. Her feet carried her away from the school, away from everything, until she found herself at the edge of the village, near the old oak tree. She sat down, the cold seeping into her bones, the rain soaking through her clothes. She didn't care. She was so tired. Then a familiar sound. Onyx. She looked up as the snake slithered toward her, her dark body glistening with rain. She nuzzled against Mona's arm, letting out a soft, low hiss. Something inside Mona broke. Tears spilled down her face, mixing with the rain. "They hate me," she whispered. "Everyone hates me." Onyx flicked her tongue, coiling tighter around Mona's wrist. But it didn't matter, because it was true. She sat there for what felt like hours, the rain falling harder, the cold settling deep into her skin. She didn't feel like going home. She didn't feel like pretending. Eventually, she had to. By the time she reached her house, it was late. Her mother was waiting at the door, her face pale with worry. "Mona, where have you been?" Mona didn't answer. Her mother reached for her, her hands shaking. "You're freezing. Come inside." Mona let her lead her in, let her fuss over her, but she barely registered any of it. She just felt empty. Her father sat down beside her, his expression serious. "Mona," he said quietly, "what's going on?" For a moment, she considered telling them, but what was the point? So she just shook her head. "I'm tired," she said. Her voice was hollow. "I just want to sleep." Mona woke up feeling like her body wasn't hers. Everything was heavy, like she was sinking into the mattress, unable to move. The world outside her window was still dark, the first hints of morning barely creeping in. Onyx was curled beside her, pressed against her arm, her small body warm and steady. Mona reached out with weak fingers, tracing the snake's smooth scales. Onyx flicked her tongue, but she didn't move away. She had been there all night. Downstairs, the muffled sounds of her parents' voices carried through the floorboards. They thought she didn't hear them, but she always did. They had been talking in hushed voices for days now, their words tight with worry, with fear. Her mother's voice cracked as she spoke, and her father's replies were short, strained. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to fix her. Mona didn't know either. She lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to Onyx's soft, rhythmic breathing. Eventually, she forced herself to move, to sit up, even though every part of her wanted to sink back down and disappear. She dressed slowly, her movements mechanical. When she reached for her school bag, her fingers hesitated. She didn't want to go. She couldn't. The thought of stepping back into those hallways, of facing the whispers and the laughter, made her stomach twist, but she had no choice. The walk to school felt like dragging herself through wet cement. The sky was gray, the air damp, clinging to her skin like a weight. She kept her head down, her hands clenched tightly around the straps of her bag. Maybe today would be different. Maybe they would finally leave her alone. They didn't. The moment she stepped inside, the whispers began. They rippled through the hallway like a quiet storm, curling around her, pressing against her ribs. Still crying about yesterday? She looks worse than usual. She's such a freak. Mona kept walking, her pulse thrumming against her skull. She didn't react. She never did. At her locker, she stopped. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle, already knowing what she would find. The door swung open, and the stench hit her immediately. Rotten food. Someone had stuffed something inside, smearing it across her books, her notebooks, her drawings. Her stomach lurched. The hallway filled with laughter. Mona's fingers curled into fists. She swallowed hard, blinking quickly to keep the tears at bay. If she cried, it would only make things worse. A teacher walked by. He glanced at her, at the ruined books, at the students laughing in the background. He didn't say a word. Mona didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the mess, the bile rising in her throat. Then she turned, and for the first time in weeks she spoke. "Why?" The laughter faded slightly. Sarah blinked, tilting her head, like she hadn't expected Mona to actually say anything. Mona's voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "Why do you do this to me?" Sarah smirked. "Because it's fun." Something inside Mona snapped. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, she shoved Sarah backward with all the strength she had. The hallway fell silent. Sarah stumbled, her eyes wide in shock, before twisting into fury. She lunged, her hands shoving Mona hard, sending her crashing into the lockers. The impact sent a sharp burst of pain up her spine. Mona barely had time to recover before Liam stepped in, grabbing her by her arm. His grip was tight, cruel. "Big mistake," he hissed. Then he shoved her. She hit the ground hard, pain jolting through her ribs. Someone gasped, but no one helped her. No one ever did. A teacher finally appeared, too late, as always. His face was already bored, already tired. "What's going on here?" The group stepped back, the masks of innocence slipping back into place. "She attacked Sarah," Liam said smoothly. Sarah crossed her arms, shaking her head. "I don't know what's wrong with her," she added, her voice dripping with fake concern. The teacher barely glanced at Mona. "Detention," he sighed. "After school, both of you." Mona didn't argue. She just stood up, picking up her bag, her head low. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She didn't speak. She didn't look up. She just moved through the hours, waiting for them to end. By the time detention was over, the sky had darkened. Rain drizzled against the windows, painting the world in muted gray. She didn't go straight home. She walked instead, her feet carrying her toward the farthest edge of the village, where the trees grew taller, where the world felt quieter. She sat under the old oak tree, pulling her knees to her chest. The cold seeped into her skin, but she barely felt it. Then a familiar sound. Onyx. She looked up as the snake slithered toward her, her dark body sleek and smooth against the wet grass. She coiled around Mona's arm, pressing against her wrist. A low, soft hiss. Mona's throat tightened. "They hate me," she whispered. "Everyone hates me." Onyx flicked her tongue, her body warm and steady. The rain fell harder. Mona closed her eyes. She didn't know how much more she could take. She didn't know if she wanted to find out. By the time she made it home, it was late. Her mother was waiting at the door, her face pale with worry. "Mona, where have you been?" Mona didn't answer. Her mother reached for her, her hands shaking. "You're freezing. Come inside." Mona let her wrap a blanket around her, let her fuss over her, let her father sit down beside her with the same serious expression. "Mona," he said quietly. "What's going on?" For a moment, she considered telling them, but what was the point? So she just shook her head. "I'm tired," she said. Her voice was hollow. "I just want to sleep." Her mother looked like she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. Instead, she just pressed a hand to Mona's cheek, brushing damp hair away from her face. "You gave us a scare," she whispered. "We almost lost you." Mona swallowed. Her father's voice was rough. "We should have seen it sooner. We should have known." Mona blinked rapidly, looking away. "I didn't want you to know." Her mother squeezed her hand. "That doesn't mean you should have gone through it alone." Her eyes burned. She felt it all pressing down, everything she'd been carrying for so long. Her mother took a shaky breath. "We're going to get you help. Real help. Not just pretending things are fine." Mona nodded slowly. Her father glanced at Onyx, who was still curled around Mona's arm. He sighed. "I think we need to make sure that little one stays with you." Mona's eyes widened slightly. "You mean—" He nodded. "Onyx belongs with you." Mona turned back to the snake, watching as she lifted her head, blinking those golden eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, something warm bloomed in her chest. The next morning, she went back to school. She walked down the hallway, Onyx resting around her wrist. The whispers were different now, quieter, hesitant. Some students looked at her with guilt, others with curiosity. She didn't care. She wasn't invisible anymore, and for the first time she had a voice. She had Onyx. And she had hope. Mona's story is not just about pain. It's about finding strength when everything seems lost. What do you think about her journey? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.